I would like to welcome you to the Winter 2020 George E. Danis in Eastern Mediterranean Security and Diplomacy Seminar. The Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, in cooperation with the Constantine G. Kamali Chair in Hellenic and European Studies, the Fletcher Initiative of Religion, Law, and Diplomacy, the Department of International Relations of the National University of Political Science, the Institute of International Relations in Public Administration, Romania, will be hosting a one-week program of focused lectures, presentations, and panel discussions. The one-week program will bring experts from different regions in 3 sets of presentations and panel discussions aimed at assessing a changing America and a dynamic Eastern Mediterranean. This seminar will address the multifaceted intersectional issues that explain the significance of the Eastern Mediterranean in regional, trans-regional, and global terms by considering issues such as climate change, migration, energy resources and security, cultural identities and soft power, public health pandemics, and inter and intra-state relations. With country experts from cases across the Mediterranean basin, the Middle East and Caracas, and the transatlantic space, the seminar will introduce students to the historically grounded significance of the Eastern Mediterranean for contemporary U.S. Foreign and security policy and for key global trends in the 21st century. Our presenters this week come from the different countries of region, as well as a background in a mixture of policymakers, diplomats, and academics. Today, I have a distinct pleasure of introducing today's topic on the cybersecurity and challenges in the Black Sea. Our host, Dr. Petros Vimbakis, is the director of the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, and our speaker is Ms. Lauren Protentis. Lauren has served for over 10 years in the intersection of national security and communications. Lauren has joined the U.S. Department of State's Global Engagement Center in 2015 as part of the new guard of communicators challenged to transform government communications in an agile and innovative force. She launched the first ever social media campaign, network, and brand that mobilized over 80 organizations from 20 countries and 5 continents in 6 months to confront ISIS, an effort that was recognized by Affairs Journal and the New York Times, among others. Before joining the Department of Homeland Security in August 2020, Lauren served as the director of the Global Engagement Center. In this role, she led the interagency efforts to challenge Iranian disinformation amidst a heightened and complex policy and information environment. Lauren joined the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, serving as the advisor on election security, disinformation, and broader cybersecurity issues. Before turning the microphone to our speaker, I would like to let you know that I will act as the host of the event and guide the Q&A, which will follow this presentation. From here, I would love to move it to Lauren, and I hope you guys are as excited as I am.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, for that introduction, and good to see you all here today. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, today I will introduce a topic that is, I think, very relevant at this moment in time. I'm going to zoom out a bit from geopolitical issues in the Eastern Med to focus on something that I think is incredibly timely at the moment. And throughout the presentation, we will sort of touch upon issues that will be prevalent to the Eastern Med in the for the coming Biden administration and beyond. So the topic that I'll speak about today is what experts are calling an infodemic and geopolitics, and we'll focus on the challenge of disinformation, great power competition, and then challenges for the Biden administration. We'll go through a variety of topics. I'll introduce the disinformation lexicon and how experts are thinking about disinformation in sort of the modern era. We'll touch upon a brief history of disinformation, go through a case study, focus on sort of the messengers in the disinformation ecosystem and why they matter. I can't go through this presentation without touching upon the events of last week and January 6th, because I think there's no better real-time example of how disinformation can activate outcomes than what happened in Washington last week. We'll just then wrap up with considerations for the Biden administration and implications for the Eastern Med. Feel free to sort of stop me at any time and ask questions through the Q&A function. But also I should just mention that I'm going to be presenting this from a US perspective. So this may seem Western heavy, but I think that's important for how I'll work through the presentation today. And so moving on to really like the macro topic of disinformation and how experts are sort of looking at it today, and government officials as well. 4 years ago, we were very concerned with foreign-led disinformation and how that was interfering with Western and developing democracies' ability to maintain their norms, their institutions, their elections, and so on and so forth. And when we speak about disinformation from foreign adversaries or hostile state actors, we're often referring to the big three, as we call them, so Iran, Russia, and China. That said, over the course of the past 4 years, we've seen sort of a combustion of not just foreign-led disinformation in terms of undermining democracy, but actually domestic-born disinformation in Western and developing democracies. So here in the US, we sort of saw an onset of foreign disinformation really in earnest in 2014. But over the past 4 years, we've seen a real aggressive development of disinformation originating here in the US from Americans, and the same goes for Brits in the UK, French folks in France, and so on and so forth. So when we're talking about an infodemic, and you'll probably hear this from experts, over the past couple of years, but especially now, we're referring to a sort of communication virality that it's difficult to contain or source, in which truthful, semi-truthful, and false information is difficult to distinguish. It comes from well-intentioned folks that are just unintentionally misled, and nefarious sources sponsored by hostile state actors across many different platforms. When we refer to sort of an ecosystem of an infodemic, we're really to sort of an information assault, if you will, from all angles. Like I mentioned back in 2014, and especially 2016 during the US elections, we are seeing an increase in disinformation from Russia and China and Iran, as well as sort of mainstream media and sort of fringe media sites sort of amplifying disinformation coming from those three actors. But what we've seen over the past 4 years is the increase in domestic, born disinformation from groups here in the U.S., from QAnon conversations across Parler, which has been in the news lately, platforms like 8chain, so sort of like the rise in domestic disinformation media platforms coming from the bottom up, as well as leadership level disinformation coming from the leadership level down. So that's politicians, that's the White House, that's any level of executive leadership across governments. So this sort of combustion, this is how I'm referring to it, is something that really came to a head across all of these sources last week in Washington. So when we talk about disinformation and misinformation, it's really important that we understand and we're using, language that's uniform throughout. So disinformation is the deliberate creation and sharing of false information with the intent to deceive and mislead audiences. Misinformation, the far less deliberate component of the two, but still equally as harmful, is the inadvertent or unintentional sharing of false information. So the way I like to think about these two is, disinformation has a certain deliberate action behind it, where misinformation are folks that are unintentionally misled online. Back in the earlier days of Facebook, or maybe when sort of like the baby boomers started engaging with Facebook, not to call it the baby boomers, you might see like somebody of a different generation sharing something that is just completely untrue online, whether it be about an Amber Alert, or a sort of a threat of like the flu, or a threat related to vaccinations. It's really inadvertent, and so the main difference in the two of these is really basic, and it's just about intent. That's the key difference between disinformation and misinformation. They both are equally harmful, but the source, that has a different sort of deliberate act, has a different intent in terms of how they share it and why they share it. So just briefly to go over sort of how we came to where we are, and what I like to call the democratization of information. There's really four key like earmarks to from the beginning of information sharing to where we are now. In the late 1400s, the creation of the Gutenberg press started creating a movement under which information could be shared from one source, and that was generally newspapers, to really the elite at the time. And then, of course, in the 1900s, we see the establishment of radio and television communications. So one, maybe, or a few radio broadcasts, a few television programs to reach, as many individuals, as possible. That was also sort of something that, earlier on, elites had access to more than others. And then, of course, the late 1900s, the internet is created, and we see, email and sort of instant messaging and other, the access to online media, as well as print media. So many forms of communication reaching many people. And then, of course, we see an explosion in access to information that happens with the onset of social media in the early 2000s, where peers are communicating with peers, and media is communicating with masses, and there's such sort of like a tangled web of information flow. Social and geopolitics. So I sort of created a heat map here of sort of that is meant to depict a disinformation spectrum, if you will, and sort of how social media has become or has been leveraged for mobilization. It's really not until the 2010s that we see social media transform from a proverbial online square to the streets, and sort of in mobilizing revolutions, if you will. And the Arab Spring was a really pivotal moment for us to sort of see the power of social media and maneuvering outcomes domestically, but also in domestic context, but also geopolitically. In the rise of ISIS, shortly after that, we see propaganda sort of being taken to scale. So it sort of was a pivotal moment for governments to just understand how social media could not only be used for holding leaders accountable, but also to mobilize a mass for violence violence and for harm. So, moving on, you see the annexation of Crimea, the rise in populism in Europe, Brexit, and the U.S. elections. In the same year in 2016. Just pointing out a sort of a number here to bring context to this. We saw in Brexit, the referendum, of course, the vote. We saw, Russia create over 150,000 accounts, pushing a pro Brexit message that some speculate helped push the referendum over the finish line. And of course, during the U.S. elections, we saw Russia establishing a whole slew of accounts in the U.S. around race relations, denigrating one candidate over the other. We saw them use tactics like hacking and leaking of emails to cause distrust in the electoral process. And then in 2020, 4 years later, this is just it's just reached the point of an infodemic, if you will. We've seen a shift in disinformation, again, not just coming from foreign state actors, but also coming from domestic audiences. And that's where we sort of we've created this term called an infodemic. I wanted to sort of quickly go through a very reduced history of modern disinformation and where this sort of concept was taken from what we call like covert action to to like sort of covert and overt disinformation, and how it was applied in the 1900s and the later 1900s. So we saw Russia, Russia in the sort of late 1900s interfere in efforts to undermine democracies in Eastern Europe, and to promote pro-Russian candidates in order to ensure a long-term reliance on the Soviet Union and then later Russia. And we saw Russia really interfering in earnest in Western democracies beginning in 2014, although we see this dating back in the US to the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was quite a bit before then. But for all intents and purposes, we see real effects from this in Western democracies in 2014. The use of disinformation, by Russia, which has become known in academic circles as the Russian playbook, was used in the 1950s to subvert alliances as part of what they called active measures. So that was everything underneath the sun that Russia could use in order to interfere and undermine in a covert and an overt way democracies and sort of developing democracies. And disinformation is just one aspect of that. The United States first sort of names this active measures in the 1980s when they see some real successes from Russia in terms of subverting democracy and undermining the U.S. In fact, Jimmy Carter started an investigation and really began, the U.S. really, in Western democracies, really began to understand just how active Russia was in undermining democracies using disinformation. And while the results of, the Russian playbook have varying impacts across the globe, Russia realized, after these sort of initial launch of active measures, that whether or not they were successful, for instance, in overthrowing a government or breaking up an alliance, just the mere interference by Russia, successful or not, was at the very least, in the long term, successful in undermining democracy, and that perhaps even an unsuccessful attempt could sow enough discord in a democracy that the long-term impacts were perhaps more beneficial to Russia than a coup, for instance. So I just wanted to go through a case study, and if you have any questions about this, enter them into the chat function, like we mentioned earlier. But I wanted to walk through sort of a case study disinformation, and see if we, as a group, can sort of work through what this is referring to. Let me just take a sip of water real quick. So the early details that I can offer you on this is, and this may sound familiar to you from the beginning, the get-go here, but the early details of this case study is that Western governments and Eastern governments noticed a small cluster of viral cases of a certain virus that caught the attention of the CDC. Those being affected by the virus were those with compromised immune systems. The US CDC sounds the alarm about this virus and the virality of it and just how dangerous it could be. They pressed the White House and the administration for funding and resources, but get little support from the White House early on, and don't have the resources and the activation of resources to contain the virus. Now 70 million people become infected globally. We see the development or the sharing, the amplification of conspiracy theories about where the virus originated. A quote unquote well-known American scientist publishes an article in Patriot magazine saying that the virus was developed in a US lab. In fact, that lab was Fort Detrick, Maryland. And this conspiracy theory says that it was intended to kill minority populations in the US. So the US intentionally created this virus in order to, I guess, affect minority populations. And then there's the publishing of a report by Dr. Jacob Siegel that claims that the virus was a mutation of another virus. Sounds familiar, right? But a synthetic virus. So really alluding to the fact that this virus was created by somebody and not just a natural evolution of an existing virus. The report receives coverage in 80 countries. It's cited in 200 reports. It's produced in 30 languages and was featured on the US nightly news as a potential factual take on how this virus was established. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Are there any ideas as to what this is referring to? Well, this is meant to confuse you, so I'll take silence as that I've been successful here. Oh wait, hang on one second. Let me see what we got. So moving on, so you may not, a lot of these details sounded very familiar to you, right? Because it's supposed to sound like exactly what we're going through with the COVID-19, But what I was referring to was actually HIV/AIDS back in the 1980s. And what's become known as Operation Infection, led by the then Soviet Union. The Soviet Union saw an opportunity to really interfere with and to undermine Western democracy's response to the AIDS. And so they established something called Operation Infection, meant to sort of undermine the US and sort of pit disenfranchised populations against the US government. So the article that was published that I referenced was actually in Patriot magazine, was actually written by Russia. It was planted in this small publication, and then it was amplified throughout the world. It was amplified back in the Soviet Union and globally, so that the KGB or the sort of intelligence apparatus could say, hey guys, like, look, this is a source coming from a different country saying that the US created this virus. The Siegel report was actually published by a German in East Germany, even though the academic claimed to be French. So he was working on behalf of the Soviet Union. And there were all sorts of conspiracy theories that stemmed out of these reports and the sort of planting of the article. The target audiences for this Russian action was allies of the U.S., skeptical and potential new allies of the U.S., existing fissures in the United States, or populations that were on both sides of a very sensitive, population or ethnicity or religion or so on and so forth, and the disenfranchised. What was the goal of this? Why would Russia, sort of engage in such a long-term and potentially costly effort? They saw, there were a few different goals in mind for that Russia sort of had at the onset. To pit the West against itself, to create distrust in an electorate already disenfranchised, and to create distrust in allies. What was the result here in the United States? In the United States, those affected were largely minority groups that were, for years and decades discriminated against. So the concept that AIDS was created in the U.S. in a lab in Maryland in order to sort of kill off minority populations was potentially a narrative that might resonate. Particularly given the fact that the White House was reticent to sort of contribute resources and funds, sort of feeds into that conspiracy theory and that skepticism. Fast forward, 30, 95, 20 years after the first sort of disinformation was planted about this, a specific journal, a health and science journal, showed that 50% of African Americans surveyed still believe that AIDS is a man-made virus, and 15% also thought that was a form of genocide against Black people. This is 20 years after the height of the AIDS virus, and those populations that were targeted by this campaign, still maintain certain conspiracies that have yet to be unraveled. So the global fallout was, causing partners to doubt forming alliances with the U.S. The Carter administration says that they received lots of skepticism about policy and so on and so forth, because even though many partners didn't actually believe the U.S. created the virus, the fact that this was being sourced globally, made them sort of, take a second look. It undermined the U.S.'s image abroad, and suddenly Russia becomes more powerful. So Operation Infection is something that you can all look up online and at your leisure. But a defector of the KGB, which is the intelligence apparatus in Russia, said of active measures back in 1984 that the purpose is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their communities, and their country. So fast forward to now 2020, and I'm just going to dissect for a minute the similarities and differences with how we've seen disinformation weaponized as it relates to COVID-19. And I'm just going to flip through my notes to make sure I'm caught up here. All right. So, across this spectrum here, I've pointed out just, some information from Russia, Iran, China, and the U.S. because, we have to be honest, the U.S. has been a player in this game, but there was also, information coming from disinformation being pushed by leaders in developing democracies, to include Brazil and Venezuela and others, about sort of the source of the virus and just how serious it was. So, we saw Russia pushing narratives that suggest that the virus was created by the U.S. as a bioweapon. It alleges that the U.S. funded research labs in other countries and are secretly developing a bioweapon. Sounds familiar, right? Almost like they've reverted right back to that playbook in the 1980s. Iran says the virus is a plot of the U.S. And even leaders, including the foreign minister and the supreme leader, are pushing a narrative that are questioning whether the virus was created as a foreign policy tool or a bioweapon of the United States to undermine Iran. China says the infection outbreak started in a nursing home in Virginia and was the result of an Army bioresearch in Fort Detrick, Maryland. This narrative was reiterated by Chinese ambassadors and foreign ministers, But I highlighted Fort Detrick because that's a pull right out of that Russian playbook that we saw in the 1980s. And even, President Trump retweets false claims that, COVID-19 isn't as deadly as scientists and health officials are saying. He's retweeting a group called QAnon, which is a domestic conspiracy network, if you will, here in the United States. And yet again, we see this disinformation creating doubt in Americans about, where the virus, how deadly the virus is, and sort of how, and that, maybe there is some veracity in the fact that these viruses are created in U.S. labs. So an old poll, like 8 to 10 months ago, says that 3 in 10 Americans said that COVID was created in a lab. So this is all meant to sort of just highlight the fact that these cycles of disinformation and the opportunities for adversaries to exploit things like viruses, they're not new. The tactics are evolving, but the fact that an international pandemic creates a great environment to sort of exploit democracies and to undermine trust in science and health officials, and even to believe these crazy conspiracy theories. I've highlighted, another sort of repeated similarity is that, these adversaries are publishing, just like in the 1980s, articles and in newspapers, sort of, and online journals, sort of pointing out the fact that they believe that this could be a U.S. bioweapon created in the United States. So there are many similarities. But the differences are that now, really what took 10 years in the 1980s to create, doubt in the US and create discord amongst allies has taken less than a year here in the US and in Europe and in parts of Africa and the Middle East. The speed of communications, the virality of a disinformation narrative, the tremendous amounts of mediums, encrypted platforms, traditional media, fringe media sites, has created an ecosystem for these disinformation narratives to really take root and to thrive. So those are some differences, but we're also seeing, unlike in the 1980s, that world leaders are at times reinforcing this disinformation. They're questioning the veracity of measures to protect yourselves against the virus. They're undermining what health institutions like the WHO and the CDC are saying, and that sort of top-down disinformation or misinformation is really creating a long-term impact in sort of constituencies and domestic audiences, both domestically and abroad. So one thing to note is COVID-19 disinformation is disseminated more significantly and more widely than factual information from authoritative sources. And that's because of this ecosystem of disinformation that I have mentioned. But it's also significant to point out that significant numbers outside of the US also thought that the US was responsible for creating and spreading the virus. As many as 37% of respondents to this poll in Turkey, 20% in Greece and Spain, 16% in Poland, 12% in France, 5% in the UK, believe that the US government is definitely or probably to blame for this virus. But one thing that we are noticing now, and experts in disinformation are realizing that perhaps we didn't have as much 4 years ago, is the reinforcement from the top, the sharing of disinformation, the origination of disinformation from senior and executive leadership. And the reinforcement of misinformation narratives. This is something that's new, that has had that that has added to the combustible nature of where we are right now with the elections and with COVID-19. So COVID-19 disinformation moves now from both the top down and the bottom up, which is different than what we saw really in the 1980s with the AIDS HIV virus. But the two sources differ dramatically in terms of how consumers are going to act. top-down disinformation is by far the most impactful. So I think before 2016, we saw most disinformation and misinformation sort of originating and circulating at sort of on the fringes of the internet, becoming somewhat mainstream, definitely fooling people to believe, conspiracy theories or, false information about a specific candidate. But now it's being pushed so heavily from the top that the impact is much greater. So 20% of all misleading claims about COVID generates 69% of total social media engagement when an executive leader like a President Trump shares it. An academic study, I think this is from Brookings, said that 1 million articles, over 1 million articles, I believe it's 1 million, that Trump was essentially, this concludes, the largest driver of COVID-19 disinformation here in the United States. But then there's the bottom up that's still, pushing disinformation. The majority of COVID-19 disinformation on social media is created from the bottom up, but the impact of these engagements is far less significant. And rough estimates from about health misinformation say that misinformation about COVID has generated over billions of views on Facebook in just 1 year. So leaders are perhaps in this moment in time more influential in driving, consumers to believe fact over fiction than ever before. And so I wanted to just get in briefly. I think I'm coming to sort of the end of my presentation in the next few moments. So if we need to get onto the discussion, definitely feel free to interrupt me. But I wanted to definitely speak about January 6th and really where we saw as a country here in the United States, the disinformation infodemic, as we call it, go from theory and sort of bubbling concern to an all-out sort of combustion of disinformation. So one expert says that this is just sort of to lay the groundwork for where we started and where we are. Disinformation campaigns work in the short term to target enemies, and in the long term to undermine the stability of social systems. The short-term goals for, here in the United States from Russia were to help elect Trump, who the Kremlin, viewed as friendly to Russia. But the long-term goal was to create lasting mistrust among Americans in their own elections. Now we know that Russia had, created, fake accounts to divide the U.S. electorate, on issues of race, religion, ethnicity, on issues related to immigration and police brutality, and all of those things. Can we definitively say that changed the tide in the election? We can't, but we know that their short-term goal in sort of pushing disinformation online was to support one candidate over the other. So back in 2016, we saw heavy Russian interference, not just Russian, by the way, also Iranian and Chinese to a much lesser extent, to sort of further divide the U.S. electorate. They created, millions of fake accounts on Facebook that actually led to street protests in many situations. It's just that the consumers didn't realize that there weren't real people behind those accounts. It was actually bots that were organizing folks for protests and so on and so forth. But we also saw, of course, this increase in top-down disinformation, especially in 2020 around the U.S. elections and COVID-19. So we see, Trump, not just Trump, but other politicians and, executive representatives sowing doubt in the trustworthiness of the elections. We see election officials reiterating, these claims that voting systems don't work, that votes are fraudulent votes are being counted. We see sort of the precursor, the sort of the groundwork being laid for this even before the election. So sowing doubt in the institution of voting. And polls, recent polls have shown that now 10 million plus people believe that the election results were false, and the election was in fact stolen from the rightful victor, that being the Republican Party and President Trump. After the election, we see, senators and local officials and, legislators and, far right media sites all sort of, and even some mainstream media sites sort of sharing this similar narrative, right? Questioning the veracity of the election, calling on, the people to fight for the outcome that they rightly deserve, and sort of promoting the fact that the elections could be overturned. The work of undermining trust in the American system that began back in 2016 is now being promoted openly in social media and on media platforms and from executive level leadership. But it's not just top down. We have bottom up. We have QAnon, which is a far right conspiracy theory network here in the US, far right media, mainstream media, local politicians promoting this narrative that the election was stolen. They're calling on people to activate, to defend the vote, and to show up in Washington to demonstrate against the results of the election, with the potential outcome of the election results being overturned. Vulnerable populations believe, to this message, believe that they're witnessing the breakdown of democracy, that it's up to them alone to protect the institutions of the Constitution. And so we see this infodemic combust, in the streets of Washington last week. So if you can think back to the image, the graph that I showed you early on with top down, bottom up, left, right, information all flowing at consumers, especially these protesters on Washington last week. They believe it's their duty to defend democracy. The one author that was published last week in, I think it was The Atlantic, says that once the foundation has been laid, convincing half the country that the election was stolen was relatively easy. From the first use of the Stop the Steal hashtag on election day on social media platforms, the narrative has been strengthened by a torrent of blog posts, hyperpartisan news stories, conspiracy podcasts, statements by Trump, his sympathizers, and other politicians. These sources all push the alternative version of reality that the election was stolen and democracy needed to be saved. So this is a very sort of quick roundup of what happened last week and why we were at that moment of combustion in the disinformation, in this infodemic ecosystem. But long term, bringing this sort of back to the Eastern Med and potential geopolitical consequences. I was in a sort of a roundtable talk with a few senators last week who said that this singular moment last week that took place in Washington did more to feed in to the narrative of our adversaries than anything else that has happened over the last decade. These visions of sort of the seat of our democracy being overtaken by angry protesters, the near, execution of potential elected officials, this is the perfect example of why democracy does not work. And this is, presents ample opportunity for, our adversaries to exploit this, what took place. Images that they're seeing show a failure of democracy, why freedom of the media is not a sustainable, is not sustainable. Allies, partners and, in the Middle East, for instance, North Africa, and developing democracies, and Europe see this as a huge red flag. Trust in the West and this, and our democratic experiment is likely going to decrease. It undermines our credibility as in foreign policy. And it provides, Russia, China, and Iran the perfect level of hypocrisy with which to exploit for their own geopolitical gains. In the Middle East, we see Russia, Iran, and China very active in trying to sort of create geopolitical circumstances in their favor. And this sort of event, great depiction of why our Middle Eastern partners for the narrative that Russia, China, and Iran push, why they should pivot east instead of west. And so just to go over just quickly some of the intensive disinformation, I think what we saw last week was the perfect storm for our adversaries to threaten public safety, to fracture community cohesion, to reduce trust in institutions and the media. I mean, you saw that image of somebody had written "murder the media" on a door of the Capitol building, damage economic prosperity and global influence, undermine public acceptance of science, think to COVID, think to HIV/AIDS, undermine the integrity of the government and the Constitution and the democratic process. I mean, everything that took place on January 6th checks almost every single box that you see here. But one of the most concerning things, and one of the things that will be the most difficult for the Biden administration to fix, is how to overcome the fear that has been created within the U.S. electorate, especially on racial and ethnic lines. So these are just a few of the challenges for the Biden administration that I think will be really difficult that will be priority number one in terms of the foreign policy space, even though I think that they'll look domestically initially, but cybersecurity and foreign adversaries, and how our adversaries are increasingly using the cyberspace to conduct attacks. How the events of the last 4 years have incentivized and increased racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. In government circles, we call that REMV. The ecosystem of domestic and foreign disinformation, and the great power competition in the Middle East. The issue with all of this is that all of these are linked, and you can't sort of tackle one of these as a Biden administration without thinking about the secondary and tertiary order effects related to all of this. I just, in the interest of time, I probably won't get into this, but basically this sort of, we can talk about this in a minute, but just sort of some avenues in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe that Russia, China, and Iran will exploit in the coming 4 years. Those will be around elections, the institutions of EU and NATO, and the sort of credibility of those organizations, referendums, the right of populism in the far right, and developing democracies and their fledgling economies amidst COVID. So I thought we could sort of talk about this in our discussion. How might disinformation impact existing tensions in the Eastern Med, or upcoming events, like I mentioned, elections, referendums, accession of new members to EU or NATO. I'll go back one. The other thing that I would suggest we talk about is how what happened here in the U.S. last week may impact foreign policy of the Biden administration in terms of vis-a-vis Turkey, Syria, Greece, Lebanon, North Africa, and I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts on that. And that is really it for me. I will pause there so we can open it up for discussion.
Well, I'm going to step in and say how in awe I am with your presentation, and I'm very happy to with so much information here to take in. And one of the first thoughts that come to mind, and I want to yield the floor to Priscilla, but one of the things that comes to mind, especially the prominent role of Russia in all of this, it almost seems like this guerrilla warfare in some way or another, where like you become like the great equalizer. And the other thing that brings me back, and in the 1970s, it was this, the Helsinki Final Act, which almost acted as a way of the West undermining Soviet legitimacy within areas of its sphere of influence. And there is this sense in Russian mentality of almost getting back. I mean, they feel that they have been wronged by the West again and again, and the 1990s served in the same kind of a motivation. So just looking at it in this grand theory, the grand history aspect of it, I just can't help but think that this is sort of the way of getting back and paying the West with the same kind of a coin that led to the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then almost like the great equalizer for the 90s and beyond. I mean, is there a sense in that, some of what you're saying, or?
Yeah, I think all of that, marries well with sort of, the Russian playbook since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think Russia sees a real aperture at this very moment with, the US withdrawing troops in the Middle East over the last 4 years, with, a Brexit referendum, with, a COVID-19 and complete disunity globally about how to tackle it and what I think all of these things, honestly, I think a lot of people would say offer Russia an opportunity like they've never had since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they, it isn't a democracy in Russia, and information is flowing from the top down, unlike, here in the US where we're experiencing this infodemic, and they have, control over media apparatuses and former or influence in the media environment in some of these countries in Eastern Europe. And I think they feel more confident now than ever before in their ability to shape outcomes. And yeah, I think a bit of it is for sure about retribution for, becoming such a weakened player after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that's very interesting is actually Vladimir Putin is from, he was trained as a KGB intel officer to actually do the very things that we're talking about right now. He's perhaps more than anyone else in Russian leadership so keenly aware of all the suite of tools like that he can use to influence and interfere. And so he's their best bet. And I think there's I think I would say that, yes, you're right about the, the sort of, feelings of, finally getting their groove back in this current moment. But I think they feel more confident, the Russian government and the apparatus there than ever before. And I think, just one final point, I think many scholars would say that their interference, starting in 2015, they never could have imagined that it would end up where it ended up on January 16th. And they feel very confident in what they were able to achieve in such a short time here.
Priscilla, it's all yours.
All right, well, thank you so much for this presentation. I think I have a bunch of questions, and I can see that the audience also has a bunch of questions. So I guess we can just jump right in. The first question that appeared in the Q&A comes, it says, what are the calculated risks of exposing people which do not have access to technology to misinformation in pandemic time for the past year election processes in Europe and especially in the US? How does that affect citizens' right to access information and avoid being the victim of conspiracy theories?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and there's a lot to unpack here. I think what we understand at this moment is, I can't tell you the figures off of the top of my head, but I think 70% of the globe has access to a smartphone. In developing democracies, in Africa, in Europe, Eastern Europe, and parts of the Middle East, or developing or at least fragile democracies, we see, for instance, China building in telecommunications infrastructures in Africa. We see them investing in telecommunications structures in the Middle East. There is a move by our foreign adversaries to make sure actually that access to technology information is something that everybody in the world that they could influence has. So I think that's one thing to consider. I think misinformation from like circulating within communities without access to technology is with at the risk of sounding like, you know, bold here, I think it still exists because, you know, even if an older person at home, for instance, doesn't have a smartphone or access to the internet, you know, they have, you know, neighbors or children or, you know, grandchildren that are, you know, are able to feed conspiracy theories into the mix and into the conversation. The second part of the question disappeared. What was the second part of that question? Oh, here it is. Sorry. I think in terms of what you know, what governments should do in terms to mitigate the risks of mis and disinformation. A lot of governments are doing this now, but it needs to be taken to scale based off of what we've seen last week. I mean, investing in digital literacy programs at a young age, like in elementary schools, is a absolute must. Helping populations from a young age understand how to recognize disinformation is key. The relationship between governments and social media companies has gotten better over the past couple of years, but we don't see them acting quickly enough. You know, I mean, there is so much information, and, you know, they say that, you know, like Facebook will say that like 95% is taken offline within a couple of minutes. It's not fast enough, and it unfortunately their technology isn't nuanced enough to be able to detect all forms of disinformation. So social media companies do need to step up in a big way. And I think you know, we need to seriously think about, as a US government, what does, you know, we've put so many resources into challenging disinformation from our adversaries, Russia, China, and Iran, but I don't think we've done enough to think about how are we going to challenge domestic disinformation from Americans? Because the First Amendment is a huge challenge in doing that, and so we need to think long and hard. The Biden administration needs to think long and hard, and I would say probably appoint somebody to the National Security Council to manage this very thing.
All right, well, going back to the point of Russia and China's influence in Africa, for example, the US still leads as being the #1 in aid, but Russia and China are pushing in expanding technology and development within African countries. So in a way, they do have control in how technology is being used and what services they have. Could that also become a threat to the West if aid is still being brought to these countries, but Russia and China are providing more? How will that affect the relationship with the United States?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's probably no better continent to take like a deep dive into than Africa, because it is stunning how quickly China is building up infrastructure and giving no interest loans to, you know, very fragile developing economies. And you know, they're coming in, they're building the telecommunications infrastructure. At times they're handing out cell phones for free. And I mean, there's so many reasons to be concerned with that. You know, you know, one can wonder, you know, is that a way through which China will be monitoring the media, you know, conversations in these countries? Second, you know, now this country is indebted to China, and third, you know, it creates even more incentive for those countries to pivot east versus west. So yes, it definitely creates a tension in U.S. foreign policy. You know, I think, you know, speaking from experience, you know, our aid is much more diverse. You know, we invest in food programs, we invest in capacity building for, you know, schools, you know, we invest in a whole slew of different, a very diverse menu of aid for those countries. Of course, there's always probably a US policy angle to it, but our menu is much more diverse, where we see China coming in really narrowly into the telecommunications space.
Priscilla, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a beautiful presentation and explain to us the problem that we've been having for a long period of time. The question is really the US government, the Homeland Security, and our government knowing what is happening and how our adversaries are really disseminating false information and devastating information against our citizens, our country, and really creating a havoc in our society. And the U.S. government and the media are telling us continuously what the adversary is doing. Okay? To me, is really working backwards. We need to do the same to them in an equivalent way, and even more, and stop complaining and bellyaching what is the bullies doing to us.
I think that's I think that's a really valid point, and I hope we'll see a reversal of that in a Biden administration. You know, as somebody, and I should say that all of these comments are my own opinion, and I'm not representing the U.S. government here today, but it has 100% undermined our ability to challenge disinformation when we have disinformation and misinformation being shared from the top. It's everything from the protests this summer to you know, our withdrawal of troops from Syria and the reduction of troops in Iraq has fed into our adversaries' narrative, and it's so easy for them to sort of.
Again, I wanted to make sure that I'm not blaming any administration. Mm-hmm. I'm blaming the policy and the response to someone that is attacking us, whether it is through the cybersecurity or invading our territory or doing things like that. And in reality, we only hear complaints and complaints and complaints, what they have done and devastated our election and things like that. And we're doing what? What is the government expecting the public will do by just learning from our security, our national security apparatus, what the enemy or the adversaries are doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a good answer there. I know that I think, you know, I mean, information in one regard is power here, right? And so the more you know about what our adversaries are doing, perhaps the more resilient you'll become to being fooled by something that you see online. Or perhaps maybe you'll change your password to become, email isn't subject to being hacked because you're hearing that, you know, Russia is hacking US government systems. The intention, I think, is to build resiliency over time. But I hear what you're saying, and that's really not landing. You know, it's, I think pointing out the bad guy constantly without providing a solution is definitely a challenge in this space, and something that, you know, I hope over time, you know, I mean, governments globally invest in public awareness campaigns to sort of educate the public about one thing or another. And that's something that I think we will hopefully see more of in the next 4 years, not just this is what our adversaries are doing to us, but this is how you can become a more a better critical thinker when it comes to consuming information online. Here's what you do when you see a disinformation narrative being shared across your platform. And I think the big challenge in that, George, is going to be the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine. And I hope the government won't miss their moment to educate the public on the promise of the vaccine before our adversaries have a chance to exploit it.
All right, well,
the awareness, it is like an example, the COVID-19 vaccine. Mm-hmm. Yes, you can protect yourself, but if you cannot eradicate it by the vaccine, you're never going to be free. Therefore, again, I believe I feel totally, it's totally unacceptable to me that we're not doing the same thing to them in a big way, so they understand that we're not going to be sitting like the sitting ducks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear that point loud and clear. That's, yeah, that's well taken.
Well, I do have another question for you from the audience. There was a question about North Africa and the Middle East, specifically with what happened. The question is, how do you think North Africa and the Middle East will be affected by the recent capital issue that happened?
Yeah, I think, you know, to my point, my points earlier, I think what audiences, you know, in North Africa, you know, saw about the events of last week was a democracy that has failed. And I think there's a certain hypocrisy in the message now, you know, where we project, especially during like the Arab Spring, for instance, that, you know, the voice of the people matters, and you know, and protests should not be met with police, you know, like an overwhelming police and military presence. The military shouldn't be a part of the protest. You know, all of these things that, you know, the messages that we've sent over the years to audience, that, you know, to governments in North Africa and the Middle East, our credibility is going to be cracked, and it's going to take time to rebuild that in order to, you know, build trust. And this is why this is so damaging long term, because again, it might cause our partners to think, and those audiences to think twice about, you know, engaging with us or receiving, you know, support from us versus an adversary. And so it's definitely going to be something, I'd say our credibility is damaged, and the audiences see that. I think it creates less credibility in our message. And there's a hypocrisy that we are going to have to really be cautious of. You know, one thing that the State Department spent a lot of time messaging on over the summer was the Chinese crackdown of protesters in Hong Kong, and our message was repeatedly, let the protesters protest. You know, protesting should not be met with force, and yada 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 yada. Freedom of the press and First Amendment rights. And I think it was maybe it was January 7th, so a day after the events here in Washington. You know, the foreign minister in China says, you know, calls us out on like exactly the thing that we've been messaging on, you know, in terms of, you know, freedom to protest, and I think the foreign minister in Russia called it, you know, a failure of, like, if the world has not yet seen that the failure of the democratic experiment is the case in point for that. So I think, just like others are calling this out as a you know, a failure in democracy, and I'm not saying that it is, it's, you know, it's, but the perception, you know, is definitely, can easily be swung in that direction.
Right. Well, there's another question that kind of moves to a different topic. Are you concerned that the Parler being barred from Google Play and the App Store, we could see the development of a brand new network of false information that fact checkers won't be able to regulate?
Yeah, and that is definitely something to be concerned with. Listen, like after, you know, when during the rise of ISIS and their abuse of online platforms for inciting violence, recruiting folks, you know, airing violent videos. Once Twitter and Facebook started to really crack down on that, extremists then moved to encrypted platforms like Telegram, like a Parler. Well, Parler, I guess, is, I don't know if that's encrypted or not. I think it's not encrypted, but Telegram, Reddit, 8chan or 8chan, wherever there's a disenfranchised community, they'll find an opportunity to convene. The launching of a new platform is, I mean, that's very easy to do, and there's a market for it. And I definitely see how these folks feel, I mean, they feel silenced. They feel, that these mainstream sort of social media platforms don't represent their beliefs. And yeah, it's whack-a-mole. As you might remove Parler from the App Store, but a new platform will emerge. Which is why the underlying issues of disenfranchisement of these populations here in the U.S. and really globally, like this is a global lesson, need to be addressed in order for there not to be a need for a platform like Parler.
All right, and the next question is, social media is clearly an enabler for the true homo politicus, each citizen becoming more politically involved or engaged via social media. In the context of faster growing social media and how human beings consume information nowadays and in the coming future, and also considering the constellation of disinformation, are democracies forced to adapt? Is the speed of the change too fast for current democracies to keep up with? And is IT literacy, as in read as applying critical thinking on information on social media, enough? It is quite a mouthful, but it's, I hope you can see the question.
Yeah, I can see the question right here. I mean, I think, listen back, when Facebook and Twitter, like, during the Arab Spring, for instance, the promise of social media was astounding. The fact that, people couldn't, or were concerned with convening in the streets, but could convene in the online square was such a change in organizing and immobilizing and creating, creating responsible and authentic governance. The challenge that we face now is it isn't just used right now to convene, for the good of the population. It's, there's so many nefarious, options on social media. Like, civic engagement is definitely a huge bonus. I mean, you see, entire political campaigns being developed off of of social media, and fundraising, just small donations skyrocketing through the last election. There's so many positive components, but the unfortunate thing is that wherever there's going to be real frustration and dissent is fine. I mean, like nefarious, like dissent that is violent and all of that, like they'll find a place in the online space. So I do think that in the US, the most powerful, democracy in the world, we are very clearly still struggling with this. And, other countries have different laws. So they're not as, they don't have as, like France, for instance, in the lead up to their election where Macron was elected, they did a 40-hour media blackout. All media was shut down. I'm pretty sure, although I'd have to check, social media, I think was like, I don't know, like there was definitely the media was shut down for 48 hours so that there could be no manipulation of audiences before they went to the ballot box. You can do that in France. You cannot do that here in the United States. And so different freedoms and different, regulations around the media definitely have an impact. And, I was in Egypt started, and, the government responded by just cutting off access to the internet. And so there's, different democracies can deal with the concern of viral information in a different way. But I definitely think we are not government is not adapting quick enough. And I think that the virality of information, it can't be contained. What needs to be, invested in is literacy, digital literacy, education. Social media companies do need to take on more responsibility for the spread of disinformation on their platforms.
So going along with that question, another question from the audience that connects with it is, do you mind addressing how the US is addressing the cybersecurity attacks from Russia, US, Iran, and even within the US itself?
Yeah, in terms of cybersecurity, now along with the onset of social media and obviously the creation of the internet in the 90s, like everything online, everything that you do online is vulnerable. And so just like it created a democratization of information, it also created another vector through which you can essentially go to war with another country. And so cyber issues are of increasing concern to the US government, but also to countries globally. I mean, we have seen a total threat to cybersecurity systems across Europe, across the Middle East. We see adversaries, not just state adversaries like Russia, China, and Iran, but just cyber criminals. Threatening COVID vaccine databases. So like, you get your first dose, your information is captured in a database. If that information is, held ransom by a foreign adversary, well, how do we know who got the first dose and who still needs a second dose? I mean, all of this is incredibly concerning to the US government. The SolarWinds attack by Russia, I think, was a wake-up call. It's been called the Pearl Harbor of our day in terms of the cyber consequences, or the consequences of this. I don't think over the last, even the Obama administration or the Trump administration has done enough in the cyberspace. I know that Biden has identified a cyber czar to actually bring into the White House to ensure that these, cyber is like a cabinet level concern for the Biden administration. But in terms of what we're doing, my agency was established in 2018 under President Trump to really prevent these sorts of attacks from happening. And it turns out the SolarWinds attack started well before our agency was created. But it is there is a earnest effort by under the Trump administration and hopefully now under the Biden administration to ensure that our cyber security is more secure. But it's definitely the next major issue of our time, I'd say.
All right, well, thank you so much. There are a couple more questions, and we do have 8 more minutes, so I hope you can answer them for us as well. So the next question was, how have U.S. considered to invest in more information campaigns, at least in partner young democracy countries and in training students from these countries? Prevention is cheaper than combating, I think.
This is such a key component to offensively undermining disinformation campaigns. And we, the US, the UK are investing heavily in partnering, doing capacity building with countries in Eastern Europe, especially, and really in the Middle East and Africa. Like, we are investing heavily in this. And the State Department, USAID, the Department of Defense even is all collaboratively engaged in developing prevention programs and media literacy programs for vulnerable populations globally. I think that really started on, in focusing on countries on the periphery of, and helping to support, free and fair, journalism, and to ensure that journalists are able to report factual information, against the threat of silencing. And so capacity building, prevention is huge. What I would like to see from a Biden administration is we really need to do that here domestically. We need to invest in a domestic effort and put it into overdrive, because I don't think there's one greater challenge to the authenticity of this administration than domestic disinformation.
All right, and the last question is there an assessment of the influence of foreign interference in the 2020 presidential election compared to 2016?
I will start off by saying that we were leaps and bounds ahead of where we were in 2016. My agency in particular is charged with election security, and there's so many things that we did. We created very close partnerships with state and local authorities in the lead up to the election, so that there was a constant information flow between us and state legislators, the governors, on a 24-hour basis, to ensure that information was flowing properly. Secondly, we invested in sort of cybersecurity programs, something we call Albert sensors. So any threat of foreign interference, an alert would come right up to headquarters, and we would be aware that there was a vulnerability within the system. We created paper trails for every vote to ensure that votes were not being double counted, to ensure that if there was a foreign attack on our election systems, there would be a paper trail to ensure that, so that we would have something to fall back on. And we created a really seamless relationship with all of the US government agencies that work on cyber, so that we were all working in tandem. We have not yet detected any effective disinformation, any effective foreign interference, I should say, at this point. There definitely existed. I can tell you, I would bet my life on it, there were probably hundreds of thousands of accounts created by Russia, Iran, China, but social media companies also put new measures in play, where you cannot do political advertising on Twitter, for instance. No matter who you were or where you came from, political advertising on Twitter was barred. On Facebook, there were other measures put into place. So the system worked, generally speaking, so much better. And my agency will say it was the most secure election in US history. We will be, you will be hearing about a report in the future that we'll be putting out on the key takeaways from the US election and what worked and what we're still working towards. I think the biggest challenge, again, moving forward, will be ensuring that our systems are not easily, not just election systems, but more broadly speaking, how our government infrastructure to protect it against future cyber hacks.
All right, well, thank you so much, Ms. Protentis, Ms. Lauren Protentis, for this very interesting presentation. I am, and hopefully I can speak for everyone, that we are all grateful for you taking your time and presenting for us. So thank you. Also, I would like to thank Dr. Petros Vimbakis for being the facilitator, and all of you for joining us and asking a bunch of great questions and staying and participating within the presentation. I also would like to remind everyone that we will be back tomorrow at 8 a.m. 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and 3 p.m. Eastern European Time, and we'll be moving to the Black Sea and Turkey and related issues, with the first presentation being the current security challenges in the Black Sea. Well, again, thank you so much for this presentation, Lauren, and I hope that everyone has a great day. And if there's any other points I may be missing at this moment, I will pass the floor on.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and I have my contact information up here if you have any questions that weren't answered during the Q&A.
Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.